Okay, great. Hope you can see the slide, okay? Are you able to see that?
Can everybody see it? It looks fine on my screen, but hopefully it is on everybody else. If it isn't, go ahead either and put a thumb up or thumb down if you can see it okay.
Okay, and my sound okay? You can hear me okay? Okay, fantastic.
Okay, good.
So I have given this a very ambitious kind of a title, but I'm going to focus primarily in three areas: the changing global economic order, the evolving nature of multinational corporations, and I want to spend a lot of time on the implications of coronavirus on economy and how that may change the global world order. I'll quickly go through this, like Michael said, may take about an hour. If we want to pause as I go from one section to the other, we can, and we can take questions, or we can take them at the very end. So now letting me change my slide. Come on, Zoom. Okay. So these are the three areas, and I would like to start with the global economic order that was set up some 70 years ago. And once again, we seem to be at the start of a new world order, or we are present at the creation of a new world order. This is how Dean Acheson described his tenure as Secretary of State under Truman at the end of World War II, which was the period which saw the emergence of Soviet Union, spread of nuclear weapons, end of colonizations, the birth of new nations, and it was a time of real turbulence. And U.S. was able to take a lead and set up the institutions and the norms, which are now in an area of flux. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on that, and that is the first part of the presentation. But to describe the global norms and global trade, we have to go way back, right to the very beginning, going back all the way to the early migration out of Africa, some 60,000 years ago. From a common origin, we diverged into different languages, different religions, different cultures, different countries and races and religions. And now we are finally converging into a universal civilization. Of the 6,000 languages today, perhaps 20 will survive in about 200 years. The great world civilizations, which used to have their separate identities, now have a great areas of commonality. And we'll look at that at the very last slide in the presentation. I've traveled to some 40 countries managing global businesses, and I find the people around the world now have the same aspirations as the Western middle class. They want their children to get good education, land good jobs, and live happy lives and peaceful communities. And fast forward to the more recent times, and as humans began to settle down in the villages, they began to trade with each other. This trading accelerated with the domestication of horses and camels. By the way, camels evolved in North America, so we had something to contribute to global trade even then. With the rise of the naval powers, the global trade accelerated, and this was the time that saw the birth of Dutch East India Company, which was the very first corporation, and that was the birth of capitalism as we know it today. Followed by the British East India Company. It was so big that it colonized the country. followed then, but the most critical one is 1946, on our relevance, which is Bretton Woods Agreement. In 1946, U.S. number of things happened after World War II. U.S. gave UK a major loan in 1946, took responsibility for pro-Western governments in Greece and Turkey in 1947, launched Marshall Plan in 1948, created NATO in 1949, and led a coalition to protect South Korea in 1950. US chose at that time to isolate Soviet Union and bind itself to Europe. And those actions led to the formation of World Bank, International Monetary Fund, Global Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which eventually became WTO, eventually formation of European Union and G7, now G20. So it was a period of tremendous change in terms of global trade and institutions. You can see the very bottom one, the natural evolution has continued with the acceptance of TPP by a number of other countries except USA. And that took about 10 years, and a number of other changes that you can see about NAFTA and so on. So after World War II, trade was seen as an engine of growth and also as a mean of creating ties among countries. The notion was if you're trading, if you're dependent upon imports and export, you are not likely to go to war with each other. It was also seen as a necessity because a number of new countries were decolonized, and a lot of them didn't really have the economic institutions to be stable by themselves. They required trade. But even then, the full evolution of WTO took about 50 years. And we all know it has winners and losers. But let me just talk about some of the winner part of it. It gave us increased consumer choices, lowered inflation, economic development, and created ties of independence. Rockefeller was 70, he was the richest man about 70 years ago, and he could only dream about the kind of things in middle class we take for granted, like smartphones and computers and GPS and a number of other things which were not accessible at that time. Also, what the trade did was really lifted number of countries into a much higher economic order. Take a look at Spain and Italy. Spain and Italy were the poor men of Europe. They began to trade with the rest of Europe openly, and they eventually rose to the rest of the economic parity, or rather achieved economic parity with the rest of Europe. When a rich nation trades with a poor nation, the rich nation doesn't become poor nation doesn't become poorer. Poor nation, they both achieve parity eventually. It takes a long time, and that happened to Spain and Italy. That's called theory of convergence through trade. Asian tigers, you heard of Singapore, um, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea. South Korea and North Korea were at the same economic level as India actually back in 1950s. They began to trade in late 1960 openly, and now they are developed nations. North Korea is naturally a very closed society and has not been able to leverage some of the progress that comes through trade. Same thing in India. It was a relatively closed country. In 1991, they were totally out of foreign exchange to buy some oil. or the imports that they required. They went to IMF for a loan. IMF asked them to reform their economy. One of them was to openly trade, lower tariffs, and India has been skyrocketing since 1991. For a few years, it has been one of the fastest growth economies. But there are naturally losers as well. If you're in Appalachia in the USA and your job in textile is outsourced to someplace in Asia, and you are 50 years old, not very mobile, there is really no plan B. So as a part of this, we did not really take care of the people who were globally affected by this. But this was a period, at least until about 2000 or so, world experienced explosive growth in international trade. 30 trillion worth of goods and services in 2014. The tourist arrival of 1.2 billion out of some 7 billion population. And there is an estimate that US households save about $10,000 a year through supply chain efficiency because computers, cell phone, the things that we buy as consumer, including clothing and so on, are much cheaper than they would be if it was not through efficient supply chains. So those were the good old days. The global operating system that Dean Acheson and subsequent governments established and modified were defined initially by US-Soviet rivalry, and those were the institutions that we talked about. In 1989, number of things happened. One was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then a few years later, the formation of EU. And there was a period of very high growth during that time. There was a sense that capitalism and democracy have won. There was somebody who wrote a book called End of History, meaning no other form of governments will are likely to appeal to the populations. And the world has found the right form of governance, except with the Great Recession, 2009 and so on, the operating system has been under challenge. The world is very geopolitically competitive. Some countries challenge US leadership. US has been withdrawing in any case. So we are, again, if you look at the operating system 3, we are once again at the creation of a new world order. And we'll talk about that, and that is likely to take some time. It's not moving again. So during the operating system 1, the early part of it, hundreds of millions of people emerged from poverty. And convergence of global aspirations, there is a rule of 30%. In democracies, if there is 30% of the population which is urban, educated, middle class, then their values dominate the national elections, which are usually education, affordable housing, healthcare, and those kinds of requirements, rather than identifying the caste system or ethnicity or some other divisive issues. And that happened in a number of countries. UN in 2000 announced a Millennium Development Goal to halve the global poverty by 2015, and it was exceeded. It is projected that last year we had 3.2 billion people lifted from poverty out of the population of roughly $7.5 billion. And this percentage increase in such a short time has never happened. So global trade was a very big part of it, and that was a very, very positive impact. But we are again at a major inflection point because the standard playbooks were written for industrial age or merchandise trade in a bipolar world. They do not reflect number of things. One is what happens in Las Vegas doesn't stay in Las Vegas anymore. We have become immediate neighbor of every other country. Everything from tourists, terrorists, refugees, email, weapon, coronavirus, uh, greenhouse gases, money, travel quickly and reach each and every corner of the globe. You see coronavirus infecting even places which are kind of insulated and do not have much global traffic, like North Korea. Um, Second, the other area which challenged the global economic order was the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, migrant crisis that began from Syria originally, and the ongoing southern border issue. All these raised populism in a number of countries, certainly in USA and UK. Climate change, not there was an agreement, there is no agreement globally as to what should be done. So we are no longer a unipolar world or a bipolar world. It's no longer US and Soviet Union. It's no longer just US alone. Now it is a number of other nations. One of them is naturally China. No nation has moved so far and so fast up the international ranking on all dimensions of power, which the US seems to be, while the US seems to be retreating. Let me talk about Thucydides. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He was a Greek philosopher or observer. When Sparta and Athens, when Sparta was rising, there was a war. And he said when a new power comes out, challenges the old order, it is likely to result in a war. And out of the 15 times that has happened in our history, 11 times there was a war. So it doesn't mean that war has to be through military, it could be economic, it could be a number of other ways. But that is certainly one challenge that people talk about. And lastly, there is no agreement globally on what to do about the weak states. I don't know if you saw today, the oil prices went negative. They closed at minus 37 or 38.
Yeah, 37 dollars.
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, minus 37. I mean, it dropped to minus 40, but then it's stable. It got stabilized at minus 37, it seems.
So which means that the oil drillers have to pay somebody to take the oil away, like $37 a barrel. And, today is more volatile because that's the end of the contract. They're on a monthly basis. So the futures are still about $20, but this is crazy. But the point is, if you have oil prices like this, Libya, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, and I don't know who else. I mean, the countries which are marginally stable and require oil prices to be about 50 or 60 to be able to balance their budgets, don't know what is likely to happen. So there is a threat that there could be a sovereign debt default. There could be a revolution, certainly social disorder. So, but the point is that all these require global action and a playbook, and the nations have to come together to fine-tune the global order. So let's look at where we are at globally in terms of GDP, because that has changed. In 1950, after World War II, US was 50% of global GDP. We are at 24% now. It's not that USA has come down, it's just that the other states, other countries have come up because after World War II, other economies were decimated. Look at China, 16%. And this is not on a PPP basis, a purchasing power parity basis. On that basis, China would be probably ahead of USA. Look at Russia, 2% of the global GDP, but they punch way above their weight given that they have nuclear power and they have capability to disrupt. Uh, so in this kind of a world where the economic powers are shifting and economic and military power to some extent still dictate the global leadership, the roles are changing very fast. Uh, Let me just share some of the average global tariffs. I do not have the tariffs with the surcharges that Trump administration had put on the last 2 years on China and parts of Europe. So these are a little older. And I'd like to actually discuss later are tariffs good or bad, but most certainly is deficit good or bad? Because I've been in USA for the last 40 plus years. Each of those years, except for maybe 2 years, we have had federal deficit and trade deficit, and yet US economy has continued to power up faster than the population growth. So if somebody has a question on deficit and tariffs, I'd like to come back and discuss that. This is our trade with other countries. Certainly we have mostly deficit, except for maybe Holland. And again, overall we have deficit, even though we are not importing oil much that we used to. So just to wrap up the global economic order, in the Cold War, it was very simple for us. American foreign policy was mainly contain Russia. China was not very big at that time. And now, even now, recently, it has been managing our own strength and that of the main rival, Russia and China. But now we need to navigate the weakness of angry and economically frail Russia. Russia, with the oil prices decline, is not going to be affected very quickly. After all these sanctions were put in, Putin put in about a year worth of foreign reserve. So they are not going to be that affected. But the oil prices are likely to stay very low for some time. And eventually that would hurt Russia. But US does need Russia not to go into disarray totally, implode, because it is necessary to keep a lock on their nuclear weapons, their mafia bosses, drug traffickers, and cyber criminals, and also serve as a counterbalance to China. China's collapse will be a disaster economically because it is so well integrated into the global trade. It will trigger a global recession if they were to fall apart. So where we are on global operating system, it is at a greatest peril when the international order is moving from one system to another. There is usually a chaos until new system is established. It goes through 4 stages. One is called forming, norming, storming, and performing, something like that. It goes through chaos until you find the new balance, the new normal equilibrium. And so it will be very interesting to see how it falls. US, Russia, and China have very different interests. So it will be very interesting to see how this evolves in the next 10 years or so. if it was to be done properly, uh, one approach would be a non-traditional approach, uh, which is to include as many players, including non-traditional people and disciplines and technologies, because you need to comprehend all of those to develop the new world order. What is happening in telecommunication, what is happening in global warming or environment, what is happening with demographics, because the aging population in some countries and demographic dividend in some other countries have different implications. Um, so it requires state players, government, as well as some non-state players at the table. And I think this will lurch to some kind of an order, or maybe actually use a process to evolve to actually consciously develop one. But the point is, going back to the first slide, we are again present at the creation of a new world order. The one that we had is not answering some of the challenges that we need in this time and age. Uh, Let me pause here before we go to the second part, which is the multinational corporation. Shall I continue with that or something else?
We have one question that I've seen so far. Gata, would you like to pass your question by?
Yeah, so thank you. That was really interesting. I was just curious about the theme of convergence. So you were saying that generally countries get richer the more that they trade, right? And so what I was interested in is like, is there an assumption there that like whatever they're trading or like so for example, like for a lot of countries, like in Kenya, they have a high tea product, like they manufacture and produce tea, but the value of the labor or like the raw materials isn't like a fair value, right? So does that require some sort of assumption that like the valuation is correct for these countries to get richer because they didn't get richer through trade, really, right? I guess I was just confused about that point.
Not sure if I understood the Kenya, the tea part of it, but in general, look at the macro evidence. North Korea, South Korea, even Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. Tanzania is a closed economy. They have a economy called Ujama, meaning the village, self-sufficient. Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania were at the same level of economic development when they gained independence from Great Britain in 1950s or early 60s. Kenya was more open and they have done better than Uganda or Tanzania. Uganda went through a dictator, Idi Amin. This is all before your time. And Idi Amin expelled the business people who were mostly foreigners, and their economy fell. Kenya did not do that. They have had a lot of other issues, but and they are not that open in the sense of the global trade, but they are very open to the tourists, that part of the world, and they didn't expel the small businessmen, which are very key to their economy. So they have actually done well. So starting from the same economic level, one country traded has done better, other haven't done better. But the macro level evidence from number of other countries is right there. Burma and or Myanmar and Thailand, same level of development. Myanmar closed their economy for many decades. Thailand didn't. Thailand is several times better off than Myanmar. So the evidence on the macro level is at the first level, first order, is very real.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Partial?
Yeah. So my question was regarding like the great power competition, and you mentioned that we'll see a return. And I just wanted to ask you, like, if you could explain what are the parallels, or how does the current U.S.-China competition compare with the previous great power competition between United States, and the USSR?
USSR and US economic, the great power competition was more ideology and military. It was, so we had our Monroe Doctrine, we had our alliances, we set up NATO, for example, which was really to contain Soviet Union. The So it was more military. It was also to contain the spread of communism. So we went to war in Vietnam, fearing a domino effect. In one country falls, other countries will fall as well into communist sphere. The contest with China is mostly economic. China is, we'll talk a little later about China. We'll talk quite a lot about China later, but they are touting their system, for example, saying that look at the democracies. Inherently, they become hyper partisan. They don't get anything done. There is a gridlock. See how we could take care of coronavirus. We could do, set up the infrastructure that they have in their country in such a short time. The infrastructure in Shanghai would put any of the cities in USA to shame, some parts of Shanghai. So they talk about their system, but it's not as much ideological as it is about economy, intellectual property right, the tariffs, state-driven governments, state-driven corporations in China, which is 40% of the economy, and the banks, which are state-owned, which freely lend to the corporations. So it's more economic and less ideological and less sphere of influence.
Would you say, but in that case, that since this is a competition between like the forms of governance, it seems like democracy versus autocracy. In that case, wouldn't that be considered ideological?
Fair point. Russia was exporting their form of ideology, and so were we. China doesn't seem to be. Their brick and Belt and Road Initiative is not really exporting their economic ideology, their government ideology. But you're right, I mean, they are a bit more authoritarian than we are. We are more open society. There's still quite a bit of state control. They're hyper nationalist. I don't put that at the same level as Soviet Union and US rivalry.
Thank you.
Anything, shall I go on?
Any other questions at this point?
Okay, so let's go to the second part, which is the multinational corporations, and they are in transition as well. Multinational corporations have been one of the biggest economic institutions. Look at Apple in relation to total of Africa, 25 country GDP Apple capitalization is bigger. Apple capitalization, market cap, is roughly 70% of Russia GDP. So if in a few years, theoretically, Apple could buy Russia. The multinationals tend to dominate where markets are concentrated due to capital requirements or patent protection or network effects that favor oligopolies such as Facebook and Google and so on. But let's look at the evolution of multinational corporations. So naturally, there was a trade among nations. Roman Empire, Alexander the Great couldn't have conquered the other countries if he didn't have access to salt from Mali in Africa or Salzburg in Germany, because the marching armies require food, and food goes bad. There was no refrigeration. They needed salt, and that had to come from someplace. But it really picked up steam in 1600s with the start of colonizations, accelerated in 1800, changed the model after World War II called Federation model, and 1990s after the fall of Berlin Wall, opening up of India and China and EU, it really accelerated, and some corporations became stateless. And then it has been fragmenting. So let's look at each of those. During the colonization and imperialistic impulses from England and Holland, that was the very first corporation which I spoke about earlier, the Dutch East India Company, followed by British East India Company. By the way, the British East India Company had 260,000 soldiers, which was bigger army than the British Army. And they are the only private company which was able to colonize a country called India. About 100 years later, Queen thought this was too big a prize to be with a private company. So she nationalized the East India Company so the country would come to the crown. But they really evolved in 1800s. That's when the banks began to loan to the corporations in a bigger way. There were advances in industrial revolution, manufacturing processes, better warehousing, faster shipping. All of those enabled much faster growth of multinational corporations. And later, as the economies grew, there was a search for resources such as minerals, food, oil, and as well as to increase the market size. This was the reason England went to war with China to open up the country for opium trade. And for most part, US, UK, and Holland accounted for most of the cross-border trade. It wasn't always benign. There was intervention by US in the politics of host countries and by Britain, like England went to war with China to open up trade and got Hong Kong in the bargain. In case of USA, Guatemala hosted a company called United Fruit. They mostly grew bananas there. And the government there wanted to take the land and pay compensation to United Fruit so they could give the land to the peasants. The United Fruit didn't like the idea, asked US to intervene, and US militarily did. Same thing in Chile. Chile had a company called Anaconda Copper Mines, owned by a company called ITT, International Telephone and Telegraph. And Chile wanted to renegotiate the royalties for mining of copper. And ITT didn't like that much. They offered $1 million to CIA to topple the government. And CIA didn't take the money, but certainly helped topple Allende, Salvador Allende, he got assassinated and somebody else was put in there. But based on that, US Congress passed a law that we cannot assassinate foreign government heads. Let me ask Mario, have you heard of that incident in Chile
No,
about Salvador Allende?
no,
Okay.
to be honest.
Uh, but anyway, we don't do that anymore. Uh, the so the model really evolved in late 1980s and early 90s. That's when companies became obsessed with internationalizing their customers' productions, capital, and management, both vertical approach as well as horizontal. By horizontal, I mean if you're producing something in USA and the same product is applicable for sale to European common market, China, India, the countries which are opening up, it gives you a bigger customer base, much higher economy of scale. That is a great thing to do. So they wanted to tap the market size by going horizontally. By vertically, I mean co-locate the supply chain next to the manufacturing. The best example of that is the iPhone or the cell phones or computers, which are mostly in Greater China. Even if we wanted to bring the iPhone manufacturing back to USA, all the suppliers from chip to the glass to whatever components that go in there come from either South Korea, Taiwan, or mainland China. And it's more parts supply chain dependent than labor cost dependent, because the labor part in assembly is actually very low. So shipping all those parts across the Pacific is a lot more expensive than just-in-time inventory over there. So some of that began to happen at that time. And the idea was, from the rich world, get the management talent, get capital, get technology, and from the emerging world, low-cost workers, raw materials, and lighter rules on pollution. For example, the rare earth metals, most of the mining is done in China, even though we have those rare earth metals here as well. But our pollution standards make the mining very expensive. Sorry, mining and refining very expensive. Emerging markets also during that time began to view multinational corporations as a path to rapidly access technology, capital, and accelerate employment. And the prime example of this is the Asian tigers, which were the South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and I'm missing one. And some multinationals began to transcend the borders. There's a company called Canon. They used to make cameras. They still make cameras and copiers and faxes and printers. They thought in 1990s that they want to be stateless. Even though they're based in Tokyo, they want their language in business to be English, even in Tokyo. They wanted their shares to be on every exchange, on bigger exchanges in Europe and USA and Japan, Asia. They wanted to sell to each of these countries and access talent from these countries. In other words, lose the state identity. They didn't really quite get to that, but that was one of the models being considered. But now, the last few years, the multinational profits are falling and the flow of foreign direct investment has been declining relative to GDP. By the way, the global trade as a percentage of GDP peaked in 2018. It fell last year as a percentage of GDP. And even in big companies, GE, Unilever, Pepsi, others, the foreign profits are down. A lot of the companies now make more profit in North America than they do overseas. Return on investment has come down. And the only bright spot is the big technology companies like Apple and Netflix, for example. But a lot of countries are now welcoming some of these because Netflix and others don't create too many jobs in the other countries. They really siphon their profit back. So how that shakes out in the future is not very clear. Also, even before the coronavirus, the advantages of scale and the labor arbitrage had won away. Wages have risen in China. Most corporations have lowered their tax bills through multinational entities as low as they can go. I set up Apple and Dell in India, and Apple India is not owned by Cupertino Apple, it's owned by Ireland Apple, which is 15%, 90%, and other 10% through Singapore. Same thing with Dell. So they have managed their tax bills possibly not much lower with any more kind of multinational entities. And also the free flow of information means the competition can catch up with leads in technology and know-how. So a lot of the profits now, where they are successful, multinational, they're mostly on intellectual property, technology, direct patent, and finance. And there is less appetite now to recreate in India or Africa, manufacturing center they set down in Africa. And with coronavirus, that probably is even less so. Because some of the investments that go overseas with the multinational don't create as many jobs like Netflix. So this is the return on investment or foreign direct investment. It has been declining for many, many years. I don't have the latest, but certainly it's not as exciting as it was in earlier years. So let me stop on the multinational corporation. They had their heydays in 1990s, early 2000, but now it's more selective and more technology than carte blanche multinational corporations. Let me pause here if you like before we go to Corona. Or I can keep going.
We do have some questions. I believe Ricardo had the first one.
Yes. Did you want me to ask it now or towards the
Yes.
Towards the end of the class?
So let's go ahead and ask it now.
Okay, sure. Perfect. So basically, I just want to ask that. So Ford recently had set up a manufacturing plant in the state of San Luis Potosí, Mexico. And my question was kind of geared towards one of the readings from Harvard Business Review, HBR, that examined, corporate nationality. So I want to ask a little bit about that. If from the perspective of the CEO, how does one kind of justify setting up a manufacturing plant in another country that is, we're being squeezed from all angles, and from a kind of profit generation perspective, it's very hard to remain competitive. So I guess how does in short, how does one deal with that kind of political fallout at the higher level?
That's a very good question. I know SLP, by the way, St. Louis Potosí. I set up the Cummins plant in there, so I've been there a few times.
Okay.
It's also the center of logistics, like Memphis in USA, in Mexico, because there is so much logistics that goes from there. So for Ford, it makes sense to set that up over there because of the NAFTA modifications. The trade agreement between Canada, USA, and Mexico, I think that would still make sense. If they're rationalizing, I mean, their plants in the US are unionized, the wages are higher compared to low over there.
Mhm.
There is some new restriction. The automotive content has to be up to 75% of North American origin. Earlier was, I think, 66%. So all that would mean that within the Canada, US, and Mexico corridor, rationalization of plants wherever the lower cost within the framework of the NAFTA replacement makes sense. I think they should do. It probably won't make sense. They're retreating from China, by the way. Ford didn't have success in India either. They're retreating from there too. They closed their plant. They sold there to, I think, to Mahindra's, if I recall.
Hmm.
But for San Luis Potosi, I think that makes sense.
And one follow-up question, if I may. Now, from the American perspective, some critics would say that, okay, well, setting up a shop in Mexico is taking away American jobs. Do you think it's the fiduciary responsibility of the firm to respond to such criticism?
That is a very good question. So for a long time now, almost a generation, the corporations have thought their primary responsibilities to their shareholders and not the employees or society or community around them. It picked up even more steam when in 1990s when stock options became a big deal and became a big part of the executive compensation. So it was in their self-interest to maximize profit. Last 2 years, it has been changing in US a little bit. Now they are looking at, is the purpose just the shareholders, meaning do stock buybacks and increase dividend and outsource? Or do you have some obligation to the employees, other stakeholders like the community as well? How that shakes out, I don't know. I have strong feelings on this myself. I'll give you an example. The US airlines, American Airlines, United Airlines, and so on, Southwest Airlines, spend 94% of their profits over the last 3 years buying back their shares. Now they don't have cash because people are not flying, so they're looking for government bailout. But in the meantime, the shareholders got the benefit. Executives got their stock compensation because the stock price is increased. So these are moral dilemmas in our capitalistic system. Different people come down on different sides of it, but I think corporations need to really think through. In some other countries, we'll talk about Germany a little later in the corona response, they actually like the organization capital, meaning the human capital in the organization, not to be disturbed too much. So their corona response is very different than ours. I will look at that. But I personally, I think there should be some weight given to the community and employees as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Marshall, you both have a question and your hand up.
Oh, sorry. So I had a question regarding Chinese state-owned enterprises, and in the previous question that I asked, the answer to which you gave, that the principal reason for China's going out is economical rather than ideological. Historically, so that was the same reason for British companies to go out. Like, for example, the East India companies. It was basically a mercantilist firm, given exclusive license to trade with India. So do you see some comparison or some similarities between companies such as British East India companies of the past and Chinese SOEs in the present? And also, so I mean, so tracking how, and you mentioned the size of the army, and one of the earliest justifications that the East India Company gave to have private guards was to secure its economic interests in India, which was going through a lot of like political instability at that point. Do you see China taking Chinese SOEs or China taking active security interest in the countries that they have invested in? Sorry, it's a long question.
Yeah, no, there are 2-3 parts. I'm thinking which one to respond first. I think, let me answer your last question first. Will they take a stronger security interest in the countries they have invested in? My sense is no. US, West in general, had 300 years of head start over China because they began to trade much earlier globally than China did. They began to colonize for 300 years. So they had interaction and presence in all these number of countries. China did not colonize. They were colonized. For 100 years, they were under some kind of colonization, whether it is English or Japanese or whatever else. So they don't have in their DNA to go out militarily and Guatemala and attack them or militarily overthrow a government. They haven't at least so far done that. But they do like, we have a Monroe Doctrine, you know what that means? You know what that means?
No.
So,
Can you explain that?
So the President Monroe in USA, I think it was like 100 years ago now,
1820.
came out with a doctrine that the Western Hemisphere, meaning North America, South America, is the US backwater, and no other countries can come and do the big power play there. China would like to have their sphere of influence. They are doing that more economically than militarily. You could call that Brick and Road Initiative, Belt and Road Initiative, or whatever. But I don't see them sending in the Marines or gunboats like England did, like America did, to other countries to secure that. I don't see that. I mean, I don't know how that will change. These global realignment of power is actually a serious question as to how this will unfold as USA is withdrawing and leaving a big vacuum for China or some other countries. But that part, gunboat diplomacy, I don't know. I don't think so. They have to be very careful because then America and other powers, and there could be sanctions, and they have such a big reliance on exports, sanctions will hurt them big time. Sanctions didn't hurt Russia as much. It will hurt China. It has hurt Iran big time. Did I answer your question, or was it?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that did, yeah.
Are there other questions before we go on to the next section? At this point, just raise your hand if so.
Mario, I'm gonna assume you raised your hand.
I wasn't, but since you're asking, I wonder if some of the mergers that we've recently with the automotive industry, I believe, well, Fiat Chrysler, for example, would you say that that is a strategy that is taking place right now, given the low return on investment when you invest in a foreign country.
Sorry, you're breaking up. Sorry, you're breaking up a bit.
Sorry, let me repeat. I was saying that more recently we've seen some automotive companies doing mergers. Fiat Chrysler, for example, an Italian company, US company, or some others at Renault. Is this also because of the low return investment that companies are seeing when they invest in a foreign country?
Automotive industry has an excess capacity, believe it or not. The biggest markets are now in Asia. US and Europe are mostly replacement market. In Asia, it's not totally replacement. It's the first time ever buyer because middle class is expanding. So that requires rationalization of the plant locations. And also somehow, if you have excess capacity, these are capital intensive businesses. Your cost per unit goes up, very competitive industry. You cannot hide behind tariffs and protection as much as you used to. So it makes sense to tie up with the other companies, either to access the market. In some countries, in the old days, you could only access the local market if you had a joint venture with somebody. They won't let you come alone. Or you either joint venture or combine, merge to take out the excess capacity. So again, it's more industry specific, but I think that would make sense.
I guess the way that I was relating it is, since it is so capital intensive, say you're entering a new market, you need to start with, say, a capacity of 100, even though your sales in the beginning are going to be 50. So, short term, your ROI is going to be small, but then cultural aspects, cultural challenges make it difficult for that facility to be as profitable as the ones that you have domestically. So I was trying to link that with, the numbers that you were sharing on reduced return on investment, but it may not be the case.
Could be. Also, a lot of the automotive companies are investing a lot of money on electrical vehicles. And that is a big, big capital investment for the next several years. And some of them cannot make it. They have to be with somebody else. I'm not sure what will happen to Ford. Somebody was asking a question about Ford earlier. They have $22 billion on their balance sheet, but they have as a cash, but they also have huge amount of debt. And they need to invest. And so they have been rationalizing their product line and the countries where they operate. They don't make passenger cars other than two models. The rest are all trucks or SUVs because they have higher profitability. And even then, jury's out. So when you have a turbulence and transition, you will see a lot more of these things happening.
Yes, thank you. Software is definitely at an advantage there.
Okay, anything else?
Anyone else? There are no other questions on chat.
So shall we?
Then go ahead.
Okay, so let's go through the third section, which is the corona implications. Talk about stimulus, supply chain, and long-term global realignment. So the global economic aftermath of corona is going to be interesting. It will take some time to unfold. After we had Great Recession in 2008-9, it created a new normal of low growth, artificial financial stability, and a worsening income inequality. Just raise your hand if you know about Gini coefficient. You know what that is? Wow, I'm impressed. So Gini coefficient got worse after the year 2008-9. Corona will create a new normal, resulting in deglobalization, deregionalization. Efficient global supply lines could give way to resilience management. If you look at the corporate statements each year, in addition to the balance sheet and cash flow and P&L and whatever else, they also have the governance section where they talk about their contribution to global warming, social consciousness for community, and so on. But now they may need to add resilience management, meaning stress testing their corporation to see if something like this happens, what happens to, what plans have they put in place to recover from those. Economic tools for trade and investment may be weaponized, and it could also result in long-term realignment of global leadership. Global orders, so if you go back 5,000 years, all the way to Egypt, no country has stayed up forever at the top, at the pinnacle of civilization. No technology, no country, no civilization, no nation has stayed up on top. Something happens which changes the order. So last century, the earlier part of century was the British century. After World War II, it has been the American century. And global orders have a tendency to change very gradually at first, so you don't notice it. And then all at once, suddenly something happens which shows the global order has changed. It happened in 1956 in Suez, in Egypt. Just wanted to pick on Ghana a little bit. There was Britain tried to, I don't know what the right word is, barricade or surround Egypt, the Suez Canal, and take over because Egypt was nationalizing it. And they sent their navy and couldn't do anything. Egypt handled it. And it showed that, so gunboat diplomacy, your question about will China do something like this? So Britain couldn't do it. And it showed that Britain was past their peak. So something like this can certainly happen, which can change the equation. So let's talk about the stimulus first. Corona recovery is dependent upon the country economic model. And Europe is different than us, China is different than us, and Japan, and so on. So Europe has large welfare states that act as shock absorber, which helps to mitigate the effect of economic shock. So Britain economy is driven mostly by consumption. So they are guaranteeing 80% of wages for employees, and that seems like the right response. Germany is a big export economy. So they wanted to keep the people, the information capital or the organization capital intact, not lay off the people. So to keep the people working and employed, they employed a shorter work week, for working 3 days a week, actually, and 2/3 of the net pay, and they guaranteed company balance sheets. USA is also a big exporter, but our 70% of our economy is domestic consumption. But we also have a very large private sector debt, which changes the response that is required. So US response with a large population, 80 million hourly workers with no sick pay leave, 20 million people who are uninsured during time of Corona. It faces challenges unlike other developed economies in Europe or Japan. And we have very low welfare, but very large financial sectors. And we think we have very highly flexible labor market. And since labor wages have been buying less and less over time, credit cards, student loan, which I assume some of you may have, and medical debts have become standard part of US household budgeting. As a result, when US economic system is hit by shock, we have to bail out the financial systems to keep the credit flowing and let the economy absorb the blow through unemployment and austerity. In other words, the wild card in this is labor, not the banks. The assumption is the prices and wages will adjust quickly, capital will be redeployed if banking system is kept intact, and growth will return. And the labor who are unemployed will find a job when the economy recovers. But that playbook is not sure can work this time. So US government for the first time has helicoptered money, meaning giving money to almost anybody within a certain income level, bailing out the companies, bailing out the employees, bailing out the banks, and but it wants to abandon the lockdown as soon as it can, which is a different approach than Germany and others, which are taking much more balanced view. So talk about what this might do to China-America relationship. And normally America has been the de facto leader, was unipolar for a while, especially during the last, it wasn't a pandemic, but the Ebola break in Africa. US assembled a coalition to counter the spread so it won't go to the other countries. US invested the money and labor and manpower, but now USA has not taken a similar leadership to respond to coronavirus. We are not even coordinating with our European or other allies. So as Washington is withdrawing, Beijing is moving to fill the vacuum in a number of areas. It is working to tout its own system, providing material assistance, is given over 1 billion masks to a number of countries, including USA, by the way, and even help organize other countries in corona response. It sent its own doctors and healthcare people to Italy, for example, to Serbia and other countries. Serbia said, by the way, they didn't get much help from EU nations. They are not part of EU anyway. They say European alliance means nothing. We only have one friend, and that is China. So if Washington is seen as unable to lead, it could fundamentally alter the US position in global politics and the contest for leadership in 21st century. The leadership in this day and age is not always just economic or military, it is also soft power. Gandhi in India didn't have a military, he didn't have any organization, but he had the moral authority and the soft power to bend England to his will. However, it's not given that China would still come out on top. It doesn't have the DNA to be a global leader yet. It may happen sometime in the future. Their economy declined by 6.8% in the first quarter. They're up to more than 80 or 90% rate in the second quarter, so probably will recover. But if there is a second or third wave, if it is not contained in China, then the legitimacy of Xi government could be a question. It could be social unrest. So it's hard to say how this will play out. Very hard to model what they look like, but looks like one scenario is that China will actually come out a little better than they went in before corona response. There is a lady from China in the class. I don't see her picture. Is she still on the phone? There was a Chinese name in in the picture. I wanted to ask if she had any comments on this.
I'm from Taiwan, so it's a
And Taiwan and South Korea had a great response to Corona, which was a model.
yeah, yeah. I think it's I'm not sure like what will happen to China because as I look through the news, I feel like maybe it's under control, but like the CPP didn't handle it really well at first, and like they are hiding the information, and I think like some Chinese people are feeling uncomfortable with this, so I'm not sure what will happen to like President Xi and the authoritarian system in China. Yeah. And for Taiwan's response, I feel like it's because we start really early, like when it just happened in Wuhan, we just kind of being really nervous about it. So our government started like almost the same time China did. So I think it's the main reason why Taiwan like handled it well.
So a lot of testing going door to door. Great. But the fear is that Corona will cause some other crisis. Global health is actually one of them. But there is a danger of countries defaulting on sovereign debt. Italy has the third highest debt, and it will skyrocket from economic fallout from COVID-19. Italy was hit pretty hard. Last time Germany bailed it out. Germany also bailed out Greece, but I'm not sure if it can bail out. So, and the corona, especially in developing world with high population densities, especially in the big cities like Brazil, India, Nigeria, Indonesia, they're all cash strapped and they could be tipped into depression if corona spreads as it has spread in the USA. Oil prices collapse, they went negative today, could cause political turmoil, refugees, even revolution in some of the countries. And most governments are awash in debt. US is 210% if you take public and private debt together as a percentage of GDP, and China is at 310%. These can be all managed, but they require a coordinated global response, and nobody's taking the lead right now. Normally, USA has taken the lead in situations like this, and so this could again have a big impact on the global economic order, depending upon how these are handled. So question is, will Corona accelerate the trends which were already in place, or will it totally reshape the global order? But what Corona has done, it has brought into visible relief recent trends which were waning American leadership, less and less global cooperation, and big disagreements among the great powers. There was already, I don't know if you agree on that, a lot of you are foreign students. There was already a decline in the appeal of the American model and soft power, even though American absolute economic and military strength continues to grow. Because of persistent political gridlock, gun violence, mismanagement that led to the Great Recession, opioid epidemic, and more. I mean, these things. And now the Corona response shows that USA cannot get its own house in order. Some of the much smaller countries are managing things much better. Same thing is happening in Europe. You know about Brexit, but the pendulum could swing from Brussels, the EU capital to national capitals, as countries question whether control over their own border could have spread viruses spread. So in terms of corporations, some of the trends, adoption of new technologies, which are e-commerce, digital payments, automation, remote working. We are all remote working right now. And retreat from freewheeling global supply chain and worrying rise in the well-connected oligopolies, especially overseas, because as the stimulus programs are being developed, some of them have crony capitalism to them. But in terms of some other trends from technology perspective, telemedicine, automation, online penetration will continue. In Texas, where we are now in Austin, the high schools are not, they are going to be online for 2 months. In New York City for 3 months at a stretch. And as that happens, part of that could become the new normal. So online education will continue to increase. And the pressure to include this resilience management in the corporate statements on social and other governance factors. So Corona is just one of the most recent shocks. Very hard to see how the long term plays out because that can take many, many years to unravel. For example, the mortgage default in 2007 led to fiscal crisis in Greece in 2010 that had to be bailed out. Stock markets took a very big hit when Greece was teetering. The depression in 1929 contributed to the rise of Hitler in Europe in 1930s. Even the end of Cold War, at that time, people thought Japan was going to overtake USA, and Japan was treating US like a colony in the sense of buying commodities and selling finished products. And Ross Perot ran as a presidential candidate, given the pessimism about US economy versus Japan, and yet US did exceptionally well after that time. 9/11, few saw the long-term geopolitical impacts such as Middle East wars, and Afghanistan is still going on after 20 years. The Great Recession, few saw the rise of populism and great power competition and hyper-partisanship in the USA and UK. And Corona is likely to have some ramifications. We won't know what they are until sometime in the future, but we may need more stimulus packages. Voters are understanding, but the mood in 6 months or a year could be very different. Assault on globalization, cost of being payer, lender, and insurance of last resort may prompt governments to take much more active role in the economy. There is a strong feeling the role of federal central governments will increase, not decrease after this time. They are gaining powers and they are likely not to release it once the economies get back to some kind of a normal. Some countries will nationalize, some will take equity stakes. There's already a talk in USA about taking equity stakes in airlines. Some will provide just loans, others will choose to regulate. For example, you cannot do stock buyback, cannot issue dividends. And the China's foothold through Belt and Road Initiative and digital infrastructure possibly could give it a head start in a number of countries in Africa and Asia. So So just looking at all this, it looks like a replay of what the world was like from 1918 to 1939. I know I'm old, but I wasn't around at that time. This is what I read in the history books. That era also featured global financial collapse, rise of authoritarian governments in Italy and Germany, the emergence of new economic superpower, US then, China now, and a pandemic, which was the Spanish flu. They didn't happen in the same sequence as now, but certainly they were all in the mix at that time also. And that also resulted in some long-term changes in the global governance. So my last slide, I promise. I don't think at the end of all this, a full-scale retreat from globalization is possible. We are too well integrated, whether it is supply chain or banking or global markets. The global operating system one, which came out 70 years ago, was the result of West's transformation during Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution. Only West could have taken the lead, but there were problems along the way, and the legacies of colonization and slavery still hurt, and that remains a dark spot. But yet the result was the diffusion of a modern outlook that relies on science and rationality. In spite of Corona, if you look at a bigger picture, the life expectancy has increased. When I was born, the average longevity, I was born in India, was 47 or something, and now it is close to 70. Infant and maternal mortality has dropped. Majority of the humanity is literate and has access to the store of world's knowledge through interconnected devices. But the multinational model may change. The one I prefer, what I like, is the German model or the old Japanese Kairetsu model, which came after World War II, which is a blend of reshoring or outsourcing and strategic inventory reserves, but mostly vertically integrated manufacturing systems anchored by large groups. So if you're Boeing or railroad or whichever, if you're Boeing, you are the anchor and your suppliers are within 100 to 200 mile radius, which supported. That was the model that Japan used successfully after World War II. It was called Kairetsu. Anybody heard of that? So if you go to, in the old days, if you went to Toyota City, which was the Toyota headquarters, so there was a Toyota plant surrounded by a ring of Japanese Toyota suppliers supplying parts, whatever they were, and they were able to bring them just in time, roughly twice a day, every day. So there was no storage capacity for the parts. It came from the trucks, came to the bay and went directly to the assembly line. So they were not dependent upon far-flung supply chains. And that has been mostly the German model, but Germany specialized in high value parts, machines, MRI machine or CAT machine or whatever, where this system works very well. And their model is highly skilled and highly paid workers create value added goods. And their model is that large exporters typically create 8 supply chain jobs for every employee they have in the main anchor. And they create economic value for the community. For $1 they earn, the community earns $1.50. So something like this, or a blend of this. So certainly supply chains are going to be under the microscope. US already has floated an idea to pay the corporations to bring their supply chain from China back to USA. But these things take a very long time. So these are some of the implications. So let me stop for any questions. And I need a break.
Do we, okay. Mohan has given us quite a bit to ponder. As we take the various matters and trends that he has touched on, and we look at this last part about what are the implications for corporate strategy going forward, it also blends into what perhaps their LBJ students might have more familiarity with, and that is what are the implications for public policy for countries. We've touched on tax policy, we've talked on regulations, there are others. But as we look at this, there does seem to be the possibility with the government relief packages flowing in the tens of billions and more to the various industries. The airline industry is getting between 25 and $50 billion, depending on exactly what is done. Small businesses getting significant monies in a new package being developed for them. What will be the role going forward for public policy? What kinds of, if you will, quid pro quos will the government require? You have in your reading packets the opinion piece by Milton Friedman when he, argued that the sole social responsibility of the corporation is building shareholder value. In the time since then, especially in the last few years, there's been growing discussion about the efficacy of that. Mohan has laid out some trends that may be accelerating that debate. And the current situation with airlines that Mohan mentioned, using profits to buy back shares, leaving them cash strapped, now needing government help. Will that leave the government to have more of a, if you will, moral, even financial position to require of corporations more regulation? With that, do we want to take a break and resume in about 5 minutes, giving Mohan a chance to catch his breath and voice back, and go into this much more deeply? I think we have a lot to talk about. We have a lot that the implications of this are far-reaching. No one can be a prophet and predict exactly what's going to happen. Mohan has given some short-term possibilities, longer-term considerations. It would behoove all of us, I think, to take the next period of time tonight to just brainstorm how some of this will come about. It currently is 6:42. Do we want to resume at 6:50? Does that sound good? And then go for a while, and then wrap it up at the end of that discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so why don't we resume at 6:50? I'll leave this on. And just come back as you can. So we'll talk in just at 6:50.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll leave mine on so that if anybody has questions, they can hopefully reach me.
Michael, this is Deirdre.
Yes.
So I just wanted to check on the format for the rest of the class. You said something about brainstorming?
Tonight, yes.
Okay, so will Mr. Kharbanda's presentation end and then there will be brainstorming, or are you just integrating that?
Integrating it.
Okay, great. So his presentation is until 8 o'clock?
Thereabouts.
Okay.
With the Zoom, we went past 8 o'clock a few weeks ago. Others have been a bit shorter, so it just depends really on the class discussion.
Understood. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm having to go in and out a little bit, and this is a fascinating presentation. I teach on the global economy in an international trade and investment course. So I have lots of reasons for being delighted to hear this, but also I really want to say thank you for agreeing to allow us to include this, to post this presentation on our social media for the Center for Global Business, because I think it's extremely timely and very much the sort of thing that helps people connect the dots who maybe haven't been paying full attention, and who, you know, there are gaps in everyone's knowledge. So this is just a tremendous opportunity for us to make these points. So thank you so much.
Deirdre, I thank you for your support through the past and continuing for the program and for what you're doing in the Center for Global Business. As I've told speakers and others in this transition period, the IBFS would not be here today without your support, that of the center, that of cyber before it. And so my appreciation is to you.
Oh, well, absolutely. We're the beneficiaries here, but thank you so much.
You know, one of the aspects of this in the course description, and going back to the beginning of the course when it was first proposed to UT, the statement was made that in the world today, there have been other times of mass, big history change, whether it was at the end of World War I or at the end of the Napoleonic era or others. This is not the first time of global radical revolution. But what is different is that today we have the opportunity with social media, with Zoom, to look at current events in real time, come together as an academic community, faculty and students and outside experts like Mohan, to ponder, to consider these changes. Not that we're going to develop a template that will be perfect, but that we can at least begin the conversation. And we saw this at the end of the Cold War when H.W. Bush mentioned, you know, a new international order was coming. That was the genesis of this course, to get together across disciplines, faculty, to look at what that new order might be. And through the years, we've seen what we now call globalization in its infancy, in its teen years, and now who knows what might happen 20 plus years later. But I think the center has a wonderful position from which to help lead that conversation, not just on UT campus, but across the corporate landscape. And so I would know from the meeting Friday that you have been thinking about this, and I think that this is something that is perhaps even existentially important as we look at the near term, going into an environment where no one, the world has not been here, at least since the 1918 epidemic, which has some parallel but not completely. So anyway, with all that said, I hope that we can be a benefit to the center. And with the recording, we'll need to edit it in terms of, at least at the beginning, Mohan and I met early, about 4:45, to begin setting up, making sure that we had what we needed. So there's going to be some chit chat at the beginning that we need to edit out. And I may need your help or some technology help to do that.
Well, we have a student who's responsible for managing our videos, and he could do that for us. I think it would also be a good idea to divide it into the 3 topics and post 3 separate videos, because they're very long by video standards.
Okay.
And so breaking it up that way, so we could just, and also, I don't know about the questions. My inclination is possibly to exclude the questions, just because that puts your students kind of on the front line on the videos. And so we can edit in a variety of ways, but I'm thinking that by breaking it up, it would make it, and in clarifying which specific topics were being addressed, then people could tune into the part that was most interesting to them or whatever. So those are some things to think about, but we definitely can help with the editing.
Well, thank you. And just as an administrative matter on that, I mean, the recording is continuing. It started when Mohan and I first began talking.
Right.
And so would your TA or the student assistant be able to go through and just what do I need to do to give you, the center, access to the recording? Or
Right.
will you be able to do that from where you are?
What we will need is for you to download the recording from Zoom. So you can go into Zoom, utexas.zoom, and it'll show recordings. And you download the recordings and send them to us. And you can put them in a box file that we have set up for that purpose. And I will send you a link to do that.
Okay.
And then you can put them in there, and then we can edit them, and we can run the editing by you beforehand. But basically, we'll just be cutting out all of the sort of the preparatory discussion and just featuring the presentation itself.
Excellent. Thank you. Good.
Okay. All right. I'm preparing for my class tomorrow as I listen. So I'm going to turn my video off, but I'm here. I'm just looking around at different times and making sure I have everything for a guest lecture tomorrow at 8. So.
Understood.
It's
All right.
good to see you again.
Yes, well, thank you so very much again. We're very, very grateful for this opportunity, and we really look forward to posting your material. All right, I'm going to sign off visually for a little bit.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think 1 or 2 students, Mohan, have clicked videos on and then clicked them off again. So I think they're beginning to return. But,
You said 650 something?
yeah, at 650, it's 652 at the moment. So there's some elasticity to that. It does look like they're beginning to come back.
Yeah.
Mr. Kharbanda, you asked us earlier at the beginning how we were doing. How are you faring being hunkered down?
Personally, I'm okay. I mean, I'm hunkered down. I read a lot, so for me, it's not that big a change. I do play tennis, so I miss that. I'm more worried about my son. I was telling Michael, he's ER doctor, so he's seeing a lot of corona patients on a daily basis. So he's going to be tested this Friday, and we hope he's okay.
Where is he located?
In Houston.
Okay. Yeah. Do you know which hospital?
Yeah. It is HCA Hospital in Pasadena. Do you know? Houston area?
I do. My mom is also on the front lines. She works as a nurse, but at the Northwest Medical Center. So it's very It's a pretty difficult time, absolutely. And, you know, the shortages of masks, the N95 masks and the PPE, it's a very real situation.
Yeah, it's actually very real because my son bought at his own expense quite a few, and then they are asked to wear one for the whole day. The protocol is one per corona patient. Otherwise, you could be infecting others if the mask is infected. So anyway, so we are where we are at.
It looks like several of us, almost all of us, are back. So I'd like to just open it up, if everybody would just unmute yourselves. And let's have not a complete freewheeling discussion, but an open-ended one. Feel free at this point either to raise hand or write a question in chat and then let us know that you've done that. I've got the chat open in front of me, but it's possible I could miss one. But does anyone want to start out the conversation with Mohan on a more global basis, taking into account the various trends and issues that he's raised and what they may portend either from the LBJ perspective, governmental policies that could be changing, whether from the standpoint of the US or another country, or Ricardo and Mario's perspectives from the business dimension.
Well, I don't want to monopolize the conversation either. So, Mario, please, if you had any thoughts.
I'll just go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just gonna add from the perspective of state and local governments. There's going to be a lot of you know, a lot of issues in terms of how do we go about financing our debt, especially now that we're in a very precarious situation. You know, there's going to be an over reliance on our municipal advisors, on traders and our bond lawyers. But you know, this is coming from that's primarily what I study is municipal finance development. But again, globally, this is going to be something that, you know, every political structure or every government is gonna need to develop a game plan on how do we prioritize and how do we deal with certain trade-offs over others.
Now, further to that, in the US, the federal government has what some on the far right see as a liability, but others from a different perspective see as a benefit, and that is the ability to go into debt. The state governments, on the other hand, and local municipal governments do not have that capability. They have to have balanced budgets for the most part. There may be one here or there that is an outlier, but generally speaking, other than the federal government, state, local governments have to have balanced budgets. And that is going to be extraordinarily difficult. If you saw any of the news outlets over the weekend, New York City Mayor de Blasio, others talking about the $7 billion New York City is struggling with, other municipalities across the country, Detroit, among others, Los Angeles in today's news, are beginning to cut furlough workers, cut back on having people take, in the LA position, I think it was a 10% pay cut. So I think Ricardo is spot on in terms of local, state, municipal governments being on the front end in the near term of how will they continue to finance themselves, many already with significant debt. And Ricardo, if you want to respond to that from your studies, or others from the LBJ or the MBA program respond, this is a key issue right now. of these governments not being able to go into debt and having to pay their bills as they go.
Absolutely. So school districts is definitely on the radar, that are really being heavily hit in terms of their credit profile and how that's going to really affect interest rates in terms of how they finance their own debt. But again, from the university standpoint, I recently I read an article in the New York Times that kind of explored that. The reaction of students that are paying for full tuition to have this experience on campus, and all of a sudden it's been transitioned to via Zoom, and we're doing with what we can, but it's definitely putting everybody in a bit of conundrum.
And as Carter and I go back and forth on this, others just jump in, if you will. Mohan mentioned near the beginning of the presentation that the price of oil on the futures market went negative today. And while it's still at the $22-ish a barrel for, I think, West Texas Intermediate, the spot market for the future has gone way down. Ricardo's studies may be able to further this or even correct it, but Texas economy in particular and that of UT have been the recipient, even the benevolence of oil from the Texas oil patch through the decades. One report I have is that for the state of Texas, for each dollar per barrel of oil change, there is a plus or a minus impact to the Texas economy of some $85 million. And so if the plummet of oil is from where it was around $50 at some months ago to then 22 and now going to a minus 37, that will impact Texas in the near term. Likewise, UT's fund has been, to a great extent, the recipient of oil revenues from the past. And so UT itself will see some impact of this. I don't know if anybody on this conversation, if you have any insights to further this or correct what I've said in particulars, but this could have hometown consequences in the not distant future. So these are aspects of how this corona pandemic could be not just with corporations, but also with state, city governments, and even universities and colleges. Not hearing more on that point, going back to the idea of social responsibility. In the readings, as I said earlier, you have Milton Friedman's early opinion piece that sort of was the flag in the ground for shareholder value alone. Do any of you have any thoughts in relation to how the trends that Mohan mentioned in the last number of years and now accelerating with perhaps corporate dependence upon the state, even in a capitalist system, how that will impact corporations, the relations with shareholders, the relations with other stakeholders going forward?
So from my understanding, a lot of like the buybacks were kind of like a showing of confidence on the end of the, I guess like the board or the directors of the corporations. So I think now that like what we're seeing with American Airlines and a lot of these other corporations, I think there might be a fear that the price of the stocks were kind of inflated because of these buybacks. So maybe we're going to see moving forward that the shareholders' interests, they'll still be prioritized, but not maybe in a different way. I'm not really sure how it's going to go, but from what I'm seeing, it's people are concerned that the value of their stock wasn't as high as it was, and the stock market might not bounce back the way it will to where it was before, I guess.
I can give a couple of comments on that. By the way, stock buybacks were illegal before 1983. They picked up steam mostly in 90s after the stock options became a big part of the executive compensation. Being on the boards of companies and being part of the compensation, I know that well, even though sometimes the feeling is the best investment for us for the cash on balance sheet is buying our own stock because we believe in our strategy and our products and whatever we can use that best for that rather than open a new plant or spend on R&D. But hidden, unsaid in that also is that it will help the stock price, and that means the options and executive compensation. It's never said, but that has to be a part of it. If you are totally economist, you would say the cash sitting on the balance sheet versus decreasing the number of shares, it should have neutral impact, but that's not how it's just moving from one to the other. But that's not how psychology and market communication works. So it does have an impact. I wanted to ask a question if I could. Are deficits good or bad? That came up big time last year in the class. Or indifferent, or it depends. Not federal deficit, I'm talking about trade deficit.
Someone jump in.
I think it depends.
Are those who say they are bad, just raise your arm like this? Are trade deficits bad? Are they good? Or depends? Michael, this class graduates. They give the right answers. Why does it depend?
So, I don't know. So, I mean, of course, I have a limited understanding, I would say, but my understanding might be wrong. But I would say that, looking at the trend, trade deficit wouldn't really matter a lot as long as there is as long as the balance of trade between any two countries is highly skewed in one direction. Sorry, yeah. So because even countries that have continuously run deficits, and US is a great example of that, they continue to grow economically. They continue to see good economic growth. There would be some job losses, I would assume, but I don't know. This is a very complicated question. I don't have a short answer to it. I can say sector-wise, yeah.
Can I give an example?
Yes, please. Yeah.
A real world micro level example. Let me ask you, you like beer or wine or scotch?
I would prefer beer.
Okay, beer.
Yes.
German beer?
I mostly prefer craft beer. I like to visit Austin local breweries.
No, we have to import beer because this is trade. So let's say German beer. So
all right,
let's say US never bought anything from Germany ever. Ever. No trade. But Herschel said, I want a German beer. So we offer them dollars. They don't know what to do with dollars. That's not their currency. Their currency is marked. They cannot buy anything with dollars. So we keep offering them more and more dollars until they agree on some exchange rate. Now they have dollars. They sold you beer. Now they don't know what to do with dollars. It doesn't buy them anything in Germany. They have to either buy something from US or invest in the US stock market or buy US Treasury bonds or
Yes.
something in USA.
Yeah.
So dollars always come back to USA in that sense. So China runs a trade surplus with USA big time. Now, what do they do with the excess? The only global reserve currency is dollars. It's not really anything else, primarily dollars. So they have to either buy something from US and then they don't find as much to buy for whatever reason. So they buy treasuries. So they are the second biggest holder after Japan of US treasuries. So they finance our federal deficit, keep our interest rates low. So the only thing we are paying them on that $1 trillion, whatever the treasury bonds are, roughly 2%. So it's not as big a hit. As long as dollar is the reserve currency, as long as the interest rates stay low, we becoming debtor nation and having a trade deficit is not going to affect that much. It's not, we have grown the last 40 years.
Yes. So yeah, I mean, I agree with that. But the point was, let's say if the trade deficit is between countries, or in this case, the currency of the world is the dollar, and that's why US benefits. But let's say, what about a country that does not have such a strong currency and yet runs a deficit vis-a-vis China? I would say that, and if that deficit is highly skewed, I would say that there should be some, there should be some amends to it.
So good question. So most of the world trade is denominated in dollars.
Yes.
India buys something from China, prices quoted are not in rupees, not in renminbi, they're quoted in dollars. And then they hedge the exchange rate if required. So the same thing happens. India runs a deficit with China. They run surplus with USA, by the way.
Yeah.
So it kind of figures out, evens out.
Let me add to that. Fundamental to all of this is the issue of trust and confidence. Mohan mentioned the Suez moment in 1956. In the 19th century, first part of the 20th century, Britain, England, its colonies, were the trading bloc that propelled the world. As in World War I, in the last decades of the 19th century into the first decades of the 20th century, Britain began to see reductions in its economic strength. But globally, the pound sterling was still what we call the currency of last resort. World War I furthered the decline of England. Then at the end of the war, the flu pandemic of that era, called the Spanish flu, furthered the decline, and then it limped into the 20s and 30s. At some point, the British pound sterling was replaced by the dollar. And the dollar became the currency of last resort. But in between, we had the global gold standard.
Yeah.
That was one of the pillars of the Bretton Woods system. It meant that every currency was geared or was measured against an ounce of gold. And as one example, $32 was deemed to be the price of 1 pound of gold. Sterling had another value, the mark had another value, etc. In the 60s, first the Johnson administration, then the Nixon administration pursued what was called a guns and butter policy. Guns for the Vietnam War, butter for the domestic policy. Guns for war, butter as the example for the policies that came in the 60s for the great for the welfare, for Medicare and other policies that were being pursued by the U.S. But the U.S. politicians refused to increase taxes. So as deficits began to run up, as the cost of the Vietnam War increased, domestic deficits began, then other countries began seeing, especially Europe, began seeing the run-up of deficits in the US. Other countries began to be concerned, began to lose trust or confidence in the US dollar as the reserve currency. So other countries began saying, we want payment not in US dollars, but in gold. What that meant was not that gold was loaded on a ship and transported across the Atlantic or Pacific to the country that was being paid, but as it turned out, it was from one part of Fort Knox or New York saying this stack of gold now belongs to Germany, that stack of gold belongs to Britain. So the US share of world gold began to go down, and then it began going down, on an accelerated basis, such that in August, September timeframe of 1971, the US Treasury told the Nixon administration that the US supply of gold at some point in the future was at risk. So the Nixon administration took the US out of the gold system, out of the Bretton Woods system, gold standard. That began the unwinding of the Bretton Woods as a total system. Where this comes into play is the currency of the current currency that you use to buy your goods internationally for import export. You have to have some confidence that you know the value of the currency that you're going to get in return for the goods that, or this nowadays the services that you're letting go. This came up again in the middle of the Great Recession, 2009, 2010, 2011. Since that began in the US, other countries, in particular the EU, but others as well, Saudi Arabia, began to be concerned that the dollar would not make it through that crisis. The euro, at the beginning of that crisis, was getting stronger. Saudi Arabia and other oil exporters began redenominating the value of oil, still keeping a significant amount valued or denominated in dollars, but began to diversify the currencies in which they would accept payment. The euro came in as a major competitor to the dollar. Not so much the Chinese renminbi or other currencies, but the euro as the unified currency of the Eurozone, including Germany, started coming up as a competitor to the dollar. That stopped in the Greek crisis in 2009, 2010, when Greece, it became known that they might default on their country debts. Suddenly, and it was one of the key countries of the Eurozone, suddenly investors, sellers worldwide began divesting out of the euro, going back into the dollar. Trade deficits, country deficits always matter in the elasticities, but in the system that we've had for the last 35, we're going back to the late 40s, early 50s, that accelerated after the Cold War, has been based on the confidence of the US, of the rest of the world in the US government. And that translated to sort of parallel the confidence in the US dollar. The question today, although it has not been broached, I don't think, but you may see it at some point, especially as a result of the 2017 tax amendments, and now with this pandemic, with the $2 trillion already paid out by the US government to small businesses, individuals, if more relief, it's not stimulus-led, it's relief packages. If these go forward, at some point, the rest of the world will start questioning their trust, or the efficacy of their trust in the US government and the US dollar. And that's one thing that I would put on the table to you to be on the lookout for. Is depending on how long this goes, if local governments, Ricardo's position, if states, if municipalities, if New York City were to begin following Detroit of a few years ago of considering municipal bankruptcy as a real option, then you may see other countries beginning to question what currency should global goods and services be denominated in. And so the discussion about trade deficits, country deficits, within a particular system, they make sense. Always elasticities, always, you can always do too much. You can have a Venezuela situation where they go bankrupt. But the country of last resort, the lender of last resort, the US, if confidence in it begins to wane, then you may see this accelerated, global orders change gradually and then all at once. This could be one of the parakeets in the coal mine to suggest to you that that transition, that evolution is beginning to accelerate.
Let me just add one comment. US has weaponized dollar as a reserve currency because all the dollar denominated transactions have to go through US banks, mostly New York City banks. US can put a freeze on those, and that's how the Iranian sanctions and the Russian sanctions were effective, because they won't process those. There was a talk about getting out of the US dollar denominated transactions. China liberalized its currency about 4 or 5 years ago. That means it could be liquid. It could be taken in or out, just like US currency is. What they found was a lot of Chinese began to invest overseas and sending their assets or dollars or cash overseas in investments in US and Europe, rather than investing, keeping within the Chinese economy or local investments. So they quickly put a clamp on that. So it's still the global feeling is that US weaponizes the dollar currency for sanctions. And eventually, I think there will be a question. Not sure if any other currency is ready to replace.
And Mohan's last comment is significant. Going back to 2010, countries thought that the euro was a good option. It was proved to be short-lived. The renminbi is not ready for prime time, to use the Saturday Night Live paraphrase. So there's a real question of what currency might replace the dollar were that event to come about. So that then comes directly into the question of the future of the multinational corporation, the strategy of corporations. To date, and for as long back of your lifetimes, corporations have, for the most part, been able to denominate, value their products in dollars. American companies have had an exorbitant privilege, which has been called the country that has the reserve currency. The country has an exorbitant privilege, to use Charles de Gaulle's comment back in the late 60s. Well, American companies have had a share of that exorbitant privilege because American companies, those with much clout, were able to know to know that their debt was in dollars and their revenues were in dollars. If corporations, but companies of other countries had to get their loans in local currencies, but then get their revenues in dollars. If American companies, if corporations, and this is part of the strategies going forward, that is going to be an element. If a fundamental assumption of your company is that you can always get your payment in dollars, and so that you always know that for each dollar of debt, you have a dollar of income, and they're the same value. And it's not going to fluctuate whether you get for euros or renminbi or rupees or some other currency. You don't have to be concerned. You may have to be concerned what the exchange rate is between the dollar and the renminbi, of how much you're going to get. But you've had hedging possibilities, ensuring possibilities to hedge against future contracts. Without getting further into the weeds, if you have to be concerned that your counterpart will be able to force you to receive renminbis or euros or rupees instead of dollars, your whole significant part of your corporate assumptions go out the window. If you go back to 2010, when there was concern that the euro was about to go down, in Europe, companies were being faced with this question. If the euro collapses, my contract is in euros. I've done my hedging in euros. If the euro as a currency collapses, does the Deutschmark come back? Does the French franc come back? Does the Italian lira come back? What is the value of this contract? If you have time to look at this, you might start planning. But if in tonight's phrase, if the gradual changes overnight, then you may be forced with risk that you had not contemplated. That is the risk that the currency of your choice is no longer there. And there was some writings on this back in the 2010 on the European side. And so you might, to the extent that this is of further interest, you might go back and look for some of those. And I'll look, see what I've got left from those years as well. So.
Herschel, let me finish up the earlier answer to your question about one country has persistent deficit. And let's take an example of India again. India runs deficit, trade deficit. So there are only three outcomes. It can either dip into reserves, and it has large ones. I think they were $300 or $400 billion the last time I looked. It also has positive cash remittance from other countries, employees working in Middle East or someplace else, sending money home to their parents. So rather than looking at trade remittance, you look at the current account balance, which is a combination of foreign direct investment into the country, remittances, trade surplus or deficit, those kinds of things. And if none of them persistently stay positive overall, then you have devaluation until you cannot buy from other countries because now they're too expensive, or you export more because your goods are more attractive. So it is a combination of number of things. So deficit is really one part of the equation. Look at our trade with China, for example, US trade with China, we run deficit. Now, but that is a merchandise trade deficit. If you add licensing fee, the Hollywood movies, music, licensing right, patents, whatever else, there is still a deficit, but not as much. So the actual deficit with China as a percentage of either GDP is relatively small compared to what I showed you in my slides. It's still negative, but not as big as the merchandise trade deficit.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, I was saying that makes sense. Yeah, that answers the question. Also, I feel that we tend to compare, whenever we say deficit, we tend to compare this with China. And there are allegations that China has artificially kept its yen weak with respect to US so as to give it an advantage with respect to exports. Also, I would say that there's nothing wrong in deficits, but if you're talking about free trade and open markets, shouldn't it run both ways? I mean, China has created walls for or barriers for entry of foreign firms into its markets, and that wouldn't that also be a primary reason for the high deficits?
I'm actually very glad you raised that question. I should have actually talked to that in my presentation. The first question about the artificially pegging the exchange rate and keeping it artificially low. That was the strategy used by Japan, by South Korea, and China. We did not launch a Marshall Plan for Japan like we did for Europe, but we let them keep their currency low. I have lived in Japan. I've traveled a lot of times to China as well. When I was there, the Japanese yen was $2.54 to $1. Things were so cheap, I couldn't believe it because I was spending in dollars. Then we let them do that until their economy recovered. And then James Baker, who was the Treasury Secretary under Reagan in 1985, Plaza Accord, forced the Japanese to float their currency. And gradually now it is about $110 to $1.
Yeah.
So Chinese, when I used to go to China, it was 8.3 renminbi to $1, artificially kept in there. and I could come back with 10 knockoff of the Mont Blanc pens, and they were like $2 each. They didn't work too long. Uh, but 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 in any case, the things were and they were subsidizing their exports. You're absolutely right. I thought they had advantage of roughly 35% just because of the exchange rate. Again, they were forced. Now it is 6 point, I think close to 6 to a dollar.
Yeah.
But they have kind of now free floated renminbi within 2% either way in a day. So it cannot move more than 2% one way or the other way. So it is not totally freestanding, but there is within a band, there is some movement. What they do, the Bank of China looks at the future contracts, looks at where they are at, and then pegs the rate overnight
Yes.
within that band. So I don't know if it is how much overvalued or undervalued is, but earlier it was in a very big way. Now I'm not sure.
Okay.
When I managed Mexico and Brazil, they were during the hyperinflation time. I remember going to the cashier.
Working on that stuff makes you not just a better actor, but it teaches you something about the way people think.
So I used to go twice to the front desk to exchange dollars into the local currency because that would change that much. Those were tough economies to manage at that time.
Going back just a moment to currencies and world economy, in your syllabus for the session with Professor Galbraith, if you'll look at pages 55 and 56, there's some subsections specifically on Europe and the euro and the world economy. They're not going to exactly get to all the points that were broached a moment ago, but they will get you in that direction.
So, Mr. Kharbanda, so I have a question, like a follow-up question to our discussion. Judging from our talk, it seems that it wouldn't matter to a developed economy, such as, let's say, maybe the US or even any of the Western developed economies, to maintain a deficit. But it seems that the strategy for developing countries to raise their income levels was to export more, to not run a deficit. I mean, Japan was exporting a lot to the US, China did the same. So Japan, and as you said that Japan, Korea, they were able to build their economies on the basis of exporting. In that sense, then, would it running a deficit be contrary to the aim, like for a developing country? Wouldn't it be like contrary to your goal of raising the income level of the people, of your people?
So let me give you argument on both sides. Look at Japan. They have no natural resources. They're an island nation. They have no oil. They have to import a lot of commodities, including iron ore or whatever else. So they had no choice but to import, because otherwise they wouldn't survive. But to import, that also means they have to export. Otherwise, that economy would collapse. Their exchange rate would be worthless. So they went through 4 different times, different country growth economic model after World War II. They were so devastated after World War II because most of the manufacturing and corporations were destroyed. But they still had people with knowledge, and they came together in a different kind of a corporation called Kaisha, meaning a village, and they began to assemble, but they didn't have money to pay them, so they paid them in rice. That's the story of Sony, by the way, Kiyomori, who started that. And so they had very low wages, and they went for consumer items, low quality. They didn't have great quality. Their pens leaked, by the way, but they were very cheap, and that's what they could export. Then they found their interest rates were very low compared to the other economies. So they went into capital intensive businesses like shipbuilding or whatever, buying iron ore from Brazil and turning it to steel. So they have gone through several times, but they have to export. And like I said earlier, they also managed their currency. It was pegged at a very deflated value, but all those are gone. There was a second part to your question, and I forget. Oh, so the country is a developing country.
Yeah.
That's why there is a lot of debate how much protectionism they need, which industries should be protected from imports so they can develop the local economy. And the record of that is that the governments have not always managed that in a very efficient political, in a very efficient economic way, because eventually it becomes political, there is corruption, there are some favored. I used to, when I set up Dell and Apple in India, I had to go to government officials quite a lot to get licensing and permits and whatever else. And there would be a line to see the minister of other companies to see them. And here you never do that.
Yeah.
You don't need to. There are no thousands of requirements to do any of that. So they have not managed that part of it. But within reason, US did that for many, many years. US wasn't always a free trade champion, had very high tariffs. We still protect our sugar industry. You cannot import processed sugar into USA. It has to be homegrown from beets in North Dakota or sugarcane from Florida or used to be Hawaii. So we have also protected our industry. But what the balance is, I don't know.
May I know what were those years when you tried to set up Dell in India? Like, what were those years? Like
2002 in Bangalore, Hyderabad, Mohali, and New Delhi.
Okay. Yeah.
That from employee number 1 to 6,400 in 2 years.
Yeah. And this was the situation after India had liberalized, and yet the red tape, like the bureaucratic paperwork remained. Yeah.
It was liberalized, but government officials had their way of still controlling.
Yeah, there's a lot of lethargy in that sense, I would say.
Crony capitalism.
Yeah. That's true.
Going back to the issue of trade, free trade, there is an economist at either Brown or Dartmouth, but his name is Doug Irwin. I think there are one or two articles, short articles of his in the reading packet. But he has a book from a few years ago entitled An Intellectual History of Free Trade. And in it, he goes back to almost the Renaissance to look at the theories of trade, whether that be mercantilism, protectionism, and then as what we now call free trade. Even though the critics are correct, there is no such thing as free trade. But if you're interested in this topic, any of you, Douglas Irwin, An Intellectual History of Free Trade. He also wrote a book, I think that came out in 1997, 1996. More recently, meaning 2018, 2017 timeframe, he wrote another book, almost a compendium, on a history of trade, of U.S. Trade policy, going back to the American Revolution, then coming forward the years between the Revolution and the Civil War, the years between the Civil War and the First World War, and then from then into the through the 20s, and then with the Roosevelt administration coming in 1932, a reversal of U.S. trade policy that had been in place, Democrat, Republican, from the Civil War until then, when the U.S. began bringing into place policies toward free trade. And it is, it's a compendium, it is a huge book, but if you're interested in trade as a policy, it goes into, from the American perspective, the policies for or against protectionism, mercantilism, free trade, and it's well worth your time if this is something of particular interest to you. And so there are two books there. I'll get the name of the other book to you on Canvas later tonight. Go to my library and just look at the name. It's there. But anyway, these are important concepts. They're misused in the press. They're misused by politicians. It's easy to see, okay, that where common sense will take you until you remember that common sense is based on a set of assumptions. And if those assumptions are incorrect, or if those assumptions change, then the logic changes. And I think in many respects, it's not such that politicians or others have malevolent purposes. I think American senators, Congress, I think they want a strong, healthy America. But I think they may misunderstand what consequences are, and that certain policies are good or beneficial when a certain set of circumstances are in place. But when that changes, the policies need to change. And whether you're Keynesian or not, John Maynard Keynes had a great quote one time. And to an interlocutor, he said, Keynes, you've changed your mind. You didn't take this position at a point in the past. And Keynes responded, yes, sir, I changed my mind. I changed it because the facts changed. What do you do? Whether he was right in that argument or not, the point is we take policies and think they're forever or think they're static, but they're based on assumptions, they're based on facts, and when those facts change, the policies need to change. It's a good thing not to go into debt until you're faced with a crisis. And if a state government cannot go into debt, or if a local municipal government can't go into debt, even for emergency reasons, then it's brittle and it can break. Whereas more flexible policies allow it to bend and have more resiliency. So.
In US, the state constitutions forbid going into deficit. They can in some states go into deficit 1 year, but they have to manage or balance the budget over 2 years. In some other countries, the provinces and states can go into deficit, and they abuse it with popular giveaways to get reelected. So it's kind of tough.
And that's a big argument in a democracy for limiting or prohibiting deficits. And it's been an argument against democracy for a long time, that the politician will play to his electors and give them handouts and to stay in office. So we've covered a lot of territory. We've gone at least 400 years back to the 1600s. And if you take into account the silk trade, we go back a few millennia tonight. I have found it engrossing and extremely important. I hope you have. The implications for all of this, for not just corporate strategy going into the future, but your own lives and your own careers, are caught up, as well as that of your university and the state in which you live and the country, whichever country is your home country. We're all caught up in this, and these issues are worthy of your time to consider, to ponder, and to begin lining out possibilities. Because no one has a crystal ball. No one can predict. And Franklin Roosevelt had a comment. Much of what his administration tried in the 1932, 1930s to the 1936, much of it failed. Some of it was determined to be unconstitutional. But his policy was not to give up, but rather, like Edison, Thomas Edison, when asked, Mr. Edison, you've tried 5,000 elements that don't work. Why don't you think you're a failure? And Edison said, I'm not a failure. I found 5,000 elements that don't work. That means there's 5,000 fewer I have to go through until I find that which will work, because there is one. Roosevelt tried, and the American people kept going. The people of the world kept going. We'll get through this, as they say, that hard times are ahead, and the world may be quite different from where it was when we entered this. We don't know. It may go back to square one. But it's important to be flexible, to not get tied down in just thinking one thought, just thinking one policy is what is required, but to be looking for taking into account more and more considerations as we go forward. Any other final comments? Well, if not, Mohan, let me extend my personal thank you for an extraordinary discussion that truly is matters of large history. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed that. Very nice meeting all of you. Stay safe. And very good discussion, by the way.